Hi kids. All right, so this week we're going into the classification of organisms. And so there are of course always some terms that we need to know. The first is taxonomy, not to be confused with taxidermy, that's when you stuff dead things. Taxonomy is the branch of biology that deals with how we classify organisms by grouping them with their characteristics or their evolutionary history, which typically goes hand in hand. And we have a lot of techniques that we use to group organisms. In the past, we just used what's called their morphology, or what they look like, to group them. But now, more often than not, we rely on DNA evidence and how similar or dissimilar their DNA is. So long time ago, the first guy to really attempt grouping organisms based on their characteristics was Aristotle. And so Aristotle tried to group plants and animals, which makes sense. He separated plants and animals. But then within plants, he wanted to separate them by size. Well, this doesn't work so well because when you look at the size of the stem, some plants grow through their entire life, and so that size changes. It could also be inconsistent because plants also grow, especially trees, in relation to the amount of water they have. So depending on what's going on in their ecosystem, their size can vary. Then they wanted to classify animals by where they live: land, sea, and air. Well, do you see some problems with this? Do we have organisms that live in more than one place? Amphibians, for example, because amphi means both, right? Live both on land and in water. And then you have lots of animals that both function in the air and live on the land. And then if you look at the bird group, you have most birds fly in the air and might be classified in that group. But we have flightless birds like penguins and ostriches. So he did start thinking about grouping organisms, and he was the first one to do that, but he was far from on the right track. So many years later, we got this guy, Carolus Linnaeus. So Linnaeus came up with the system for classifying organisms that scientists still use today, with maybe slight modifications, but the basics of what he did, we still use today, over 300 years later. That's a pretty good system. Anything that sticks around for 300 years is pretty good. So he was looking at their morphology, or their structural similarity, so how physically they are similar. And that's how he was grouping organisms. So he's also the guy who introduced scientific names. And so as a scientist, we memorize a bunch of scientific names, and that's how we communicate with each other. And there's a reason for that, and we'll talk about why in a second. So this scientific name down here, Homo sapiens, is the scientific name for modern man, for us. All right, we are Homo sapiens. So when we're looking at classifying organisms, we have these different levels of classification. The largest is the domain. It's even bigger than the kingdom. And then it goes all the way down to a species. And once you get to species, you're very specific. You're talking about a particular organism. So, for example, there are many species within a genus, many genuses filled with many species, and a family. Many families in an order, many orders in a class, many classes in a phylum, and of course, many phylums in a kingdom, because when you get up to a kingdom, which we're more familiar with, like kingdom Animalia, is all the animals on our planet. That's a lot of organisms. And then you can narrow it all the way down to a species like Homo sapiens, which is just the humans on our planet. Okay? So in your notes, you have little boxes. The largest box you're going to put kingdom in, okay? We'll talk about domains separately. Largest box is kingdom because that has the most organisms in it. Down from that, phyla, which is the plural of phylum. Then we have our classes, orders, families, genera, which is the plural of genus, and species, of course, the most specific, right? And the least number of organisms within a species. So there's a little trick, and those are the boxes off to the side, a little trick for remembering these in order, because you do have to remember them in order, and the little trick is King Philip came over for great spaghetti. So if you remember that sentence, King Philip came over for great spaghetti, you can remember kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. King Philip came over for great spaghetti. And this guy's just on here because he's hilarious and he's eating spaghetti. So scientific names, what they're called is binomial nomenclature. And if we break that down, bi means two, nomial means name, so to name, and nomenclature is name system. Nomenclature is a system. So to name, naming system, and that's what a scientific name is. There's two words in a scientific name. The first word is the genus that species belongs to, okay? It's the genus. So it's always capitalized. So for us, we are in genus Homo. There were other homos. So there's Homo sapien, there was Homo erectus, there was Homo habilis, all right? There was a whole bunch. They're no longer with us, okay, but they did exist. So the first word is the genus, and the second word is the species. So that's the most specific you can get, right? So there are no other sapiens. We're the only ones. There were other homos, but we were the only sapiens. All right, always lowercase there. So the species name typically is descriptive or named after a person. And the convention is that if you find a new species, you don't name it after yourself because that's a little egotistical, but you name it after someone else, someone that you admire. Okay. So that's mostly the case. It's not always the case, but mostly the case. We also, when we are handwriting binomial nomenclature or scientific names, we underline them, okay? And if you're typing it, you put them in italics. So you will always see them that way when they're written. Most of these words are based in Latin, and there's a reason why scientists use Latin. They use Latin because Latin is considered a dead language. Nobody speaks it as their common language. We still use it a lot. And Latin is very common in the scientific community because a lot of our science words are based in Latin. So Latin or Greek. So we do use Latin for these words, and so if you know a little Latin, if you're taking Latin, you might be able to decipher what some of the words mean. There's another reason why we use common names. So when I used to be a zookeeper, one of the things I was involved with is the species survival plan for mountain lions. In North America, we typically do call them mountain lions. And I used to have to call zoos in South America to talk to them about their mountain lions to see if we could trade for genetic purposes. And so I would have to call them. And if I called them and I said, hey, I have 2 male mountain lions, they would have no idea what I was talking about. They would think I was talking about African lions. They would have no idea. And the reason why is because they do not call them mountain lions. They call them pumas. Other places will call them a wildcat or a catamount or a cougar. So there's lots and lots of names for the same tawny brown colored cat that roams our mountains. So depending on where you're talking to, they're going to use these different names and they might not know the other names. So instead, if I was calling about the mountain lion, I'd say, hey, I have 2 male Felis concolor, because the scientific name is the same no matter where you are. And once I said Felis concolor, they immediately knew what I was talking about because they were also memorizing scientific names the same way I was as a zoologist. So here's some really cool names that I like that are scientific names. So I got Haliaeetus leucocephalus. Notice that this one is underlined. The genus name is capitalized, and the species name is lowercase. So Haliaeetus leucocephalus is the bald eagle. And if you break this down, Haliaeetus means fish eater, which is what they do eat. They eat fish, as you can see from that little guy grabbing it out of the water. And leuco has to do with white, and that's another word that you see a lot in science, like we have leukocytes, which are white blood cells. So leuco, and then cephalus is head, so fish-eating white head, which is very descriptive of the bald eagle when you translate that. Down here, these little guys, I got a lot of fun stories about them. These are poison dart frogs, all right? Dendrobates azuris. And so if you are taking Latin or Spanish even, if you're taking Spanish, you probably know the word azul, which is also based in Latin, is blue. So this little guy right here, this is the particular one that this scientific name goes with. This is the blue poison dart frog. Dendrobates has to do with trees, and these guys are found up in the trees. And then I had to throw a tortoise in here because I love tortoises. Geochelone pardalis. Geochelone pardalis was the scientific name. And notice again, Geochelone was the genus, and then pardalis was the species, and the genus is capitalized, and this one's done in italics. So Geochelone has to do with like geology, rocks, all right, and chelone has to do with shell. So rock shell, and then pardalis has to do with spotted. So this particular tortoise is the leopard tortoise, and they have spots as adults all over their shells. So we have 3 domains which are larger than our kingdoms, and you're probably familiar already with some of our kingdoms like Kingdom Animalia, Kingdom Plantae. You may know the fungi group already. I don't know if you know protists, but all these guys belong in Eukaryota, which this word should sound familiar to you because we've talked about eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are organisms that have a nucleus, right? Euky nuki, pro no. So these guys are all our nucleus organisms, include animals, fungi, plants, and all the different protists. So they're all in one group, one domain, and then you can break them apart into the kingdoms. Now over here, we got 2 bacterial groups. So these are prokaryotes, bacteria are prokaryotes, and they have no nucleus and no membrane-bound organelles. So we got eubacteria. See, bacteria is right in its name, which is handy. And this means like true bacteria. So this is your regular, everyday bacteria that's living all over the place. That's on your skin, living in your nose, in your digestive tract, everywhere. Then we got the archaea, which archaea bacteria are bacteria that live in extreme habitats, okay? So it's kind of a branch off of the regular bacteria. So they have ones that live in like the salt lakes where other life would dry out and die, but they're adapted to that. We have ones that live in the thermal vents in the bottom of the ocean that other organisms that aren't adapted to that would simply melt. So kind of cool that a unicellular organism could live in these extreme environments and survive. They even have acetophiles that live in acid, and they can survive that. So what determines which domain you go into? It has to do with sequence of bases, and they use ribosomal RNA is what they compare. So remember, ribosomes are made out of rRNA. So they sequence that, and they look for differences and similarities between the two. So here's our 6 kingdom classification. So this is what needs to go in your chart there that you have in your notes. The first to evolve was eubacteria, which makes sense that a one-celled organism came first. They're very simple. They don't even have a nucleus. So eubacteria is our regular everyday bacteria, true bacteria. They're prokaryotic and unicellular. From there, shortly thereafter, and I use that shortly term kind of funny-like because all this stuff took a long time, archaebacteria. So extreme environment bacteria, still unicellular, still prokaryotic, but they can live places that the normal bacteria cannot. And that's because of differences in things like their cell wall. Then we got protista. We're going to be talking about protists more later. Protists are like the junk drawer of the classification system. They're not quite plants, not quite animals, and not quite fungi. These guys are usually microscopic. Most of them live in the water, but they do have a nucleus, which sets them apart from the bacteria. And they could be unicellular, multicellular. There's all kinds of different things going in there with them. Some of them do photosynthesis. Some of them do cellular respiration. It's a little bit of a junk drawer, but all of them have a nucleus. From there evolved Kingdom Plantae, which you're familiar with plants. Kingdom Animalia, which you should be familiar with animals because you are one. And Kingdom Fungi. Fungi is mushrooms and mold. So what tells which one they go in first? The cell type, if you're prokaryotic, no nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles, or eukaryotic, you do have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. So that's pretty easy to see under a microscope. Then the number of cells, if you're unicellular or multicellular. So all these top kingdoms, large organisms that are multicellular. The protist, the junk drawer, has a little bit of both. And then these bottom guys, all unicellular. Mode of nutrition, cellular respiration, or photosynthesis, or there's something called chemosynthesis where they make food from chemicals. So when we're looking at this, the only ones that do photosynthesis are Plantae, and some protists. Now, fungi do not do photosynthesis. They are not green. All right, in order to do photosynthesis, they got to be green. There are some green protists like algae, and then there's plants. All right, and then cellular respiration is everybody else. So when we group these organisms, we use some things called systematics. We like to put them in charts and organize them and have branching trees that we call cladograms. So if we look at this cladogram right here, you'll notice, first of all, they're organized by the different levels we just learned in classification. So the smallest is a species, and that's when we get down to these individual organisms. Then the genus, which could have multiple species. Then the family, and then the order. So if we look here, some of the things we can see is that Canis lupus, which is a wolf, and Canis familiaris, which is our domestic dog, are closely related. And how you can tell is you look at this V shape here, and where the two lines come together, that's where their common ancestor was. Now, the common ancestor of modern wolf and our domestic dogs was other wolves, right? We domesticated dogs from wolves. We selected ones very purposely to do that. And now we have everything from a Great Dane to a Chihuahua. So here's their common ancestor, and these guys branched off and stayed wild and stayed very much like the wolves that produced dogs. And then, of course, our dogs became very different because of artificial selection that humans did. Now, what you might not know is that dogs and otters and skunks and cats are all related. So dogs, both wolf and domestic dog, are most closely related to the mustelids, so family Mustelidae. These are the musty smelling animals. So I don't know if you ever smelled an otter, but that's some of the worst animals I've ever worked with. Their poo is just rancid. These guys stink, and it's mostly because what they eat eggs and fish and really stinky stuff. So otters and skunks are fairly closely related. They go back to the same family, not as closely related as the dogs are, but still pretty closely related. And this makes sense because, like I said, the otter is really, really stinky. And if you go to the zoo and you watch some otters for a while, they love to rub their faces and their butts on everything. And what they're doing is using scent glands to mark things. Well, how a skunk works, how they spray you, it's a modified scent gland. All right? It's called an anal gland, which dogs also have, and so do cats. So all these guys have this, and that's why dogs like to smell each other's butts. They're not actually smelling their butt, they're smelling the scent glands on either side. And some of you might have dogs where they have to have their scent glands released every now and then and get cleaned out. Otherwise, they end up spraying them in your house and it smells. So these guys have a spray. These guys have a spray. It just doesn't spray out quite the way. These guys have taken it to a whole new level. But that's all it is. It's an anal gland that they're squirting at you, and that sticky stuff that comes out that's super smelly is very protein-based, just like the stuff that all the other guys have. And so cats do the same thing. You might have a cat at home that sometimes lifts her tail and kind of wiggles her butt around on your furniture. She is scent marking your furniture. She also has them on her face, just like dogs do, and the otter, where they will rub their face against things. So if your cat headbutts you and rubs her cheeks on you, she is marking you as belonging to her. So these scent glands are very common in the order Carnivora. Okay, that's all the carnivores. And so since then, the cats branched off first and became their little specialists. Then the dogs branched off, and then we got our mustelids up here. So they are all related, but the most closely related is where the V's come together most recently in time. Okay. So these phylogenetic trees, and you can break that down. Philo has to do with phylogeny, so how they're arranged. Genetic, because a lot of times we're using genes to use this, and trees. So it's a branching tree showing our evolutionary relationships. And so the evidence used for this is our fossil record. And when we get into evolution, we'll talk more about how the fossil record works. And you should have learned some of that from Earth Science. Morphology, or how they look. So those similarities, like those anal glands. Ecological patterns development, that means basically where they're found on the planet. So are they found in similar habitats or in adjacent areas? And then the number one, the big one, is of course genetics now. That's right now our very best evidence for everything. So here is a simple phylogenetic tree. So if we look at the tree, whenever they come together, that's a common ancestor, right? Wherever the two lines come together, common ancestor. And so this down here is going to be the common ancestor of all these organisms. Because if you go back far enough, everyone's related. Even if you look at humans, if you go back and you look at your ancestry, everybody is related to somebody famous at some point. Because as you go back in time, there were less and less people on the planet. So those branching family trees start to come together. So same thing here, right? These guys come together. So here's the common ancestor between the lamprey and everybody else. And a lamprey is a jawless fish. It is not very similar to these other guys at all. And so he's considered an outgroup. Here you see the word jaws. This is where jaws evolved after lamprey because they don't have jaws. And everybody else since then has jaws. Here's lungs. So lungs obviously evolved after fish. So everybody after lungs, after that lungs point, has lungs of some kind, right? So these are called derived traits or derived characteristics, that wherever they are, after that point, everybody has that. So feathers right here, all the birds like the pigeons are going to have feathers, but nobody else does. So depending on where they fall on here, tells you who has what characteristics, as well as where the organisms should go. A very interesting thing here, you look at who's most closely related to the pigeon. Well, who has the most recent common ancestor? A crocodile. So crocodiles and pigeons are closely related. Birds in general are actually just reptiles with feathers. They have scales on their feet, just like reptiles do. And if you go back and look at the history of birds, they came from dinosaurs, which were reptiles. So here's another example of a tree of life or a phylogenetic tree. So if you look at this, this goes back to our protists, our junk drawer, and from them came all our plants, fungi, and then all of our animals. And remember how I talked about the bird thing? Here's my bird, and its most common ancestor is this guy, a pterodactyl or a pteranodon or something like that over there, right? And then there is some of our T-Rex type theropods that are also related, which is why birds are so mean. They always attack me at the zoo. It's always the birds. All right, and then you got other reptiles like turtles that have been around. And if you look at a human up here, we are most closely related to other large apes, which makes sense. Genetically, our closest living relative is a chimpanzee. We share something like 98.6% of the same DNA with a chimpanzee. All right. Oh, let me clarify something real quick before I move on for those of you at home. When I say that we share 98.6% of our DNA from chimpanzees, we did not come from chimpanzees. A lot of people think that's how it happens because they show those pictures of evolution and it has like a monkey and a chimp and a human. That is not at all correct. No scientist is saying that that is correct. That's just how the media likes to depict evolution. Evolution is actually way, way, way more complex than that. We did not come from chimpanzees, but we have a common ancestor with them at some point way back in time. And humans branched off and became what we are today, and chimps branched off and became chimps. Okay? And if you want to learn more about what they say is human evolution, you can go in and look at that. I'm not going to go into that a lot in class, but it is very complex. There's a lot going on there, okay? So let's look at these cladograms here. So we're back to our dinosaurs and our little birdies over here. So a cladogram is a method of a phylogenetic classification that uses those shared derived characteristics to show evolutionary relationships. And so a shared derived character is any feature that evolved only in that group. And so the great example is birds, because birds over here are the only ones with feathers. And they evolved, and dinosaurs at some point, when you had like Archaeopteryx, you started having feathers. And Archaeopteryx did not fly the same way birds did today, but may have used those feathers actually to keep him warm. We're not sure. Could also have been something to attract mates, kind of like how a peacock uses theirs. So we don't know for sure, and we probably never will know for sure. But what we do know is that the birds today all have a common ancestor that goes back to those dinosaurs that had those first feathers that evolved in them. So here is a pretty good cladogram showing our shared derived characteristics here. So here we have, there's that lamprey again, and there's the characteristic of jaws. So everything after that point had jaws, which makes sense. Jaws, tuna, salamander, turtle, leopard, yep, all jaws. These guys do not. Both these are jawless fish. But the lamprey has a vertebrae. Lancelet doesn't even have that. He doesn't have much of anything. All right, then we got walking legs. That came before the salamander. An amniotic egg is just like an egg that has egg whites around it, okay, to be very simple. And mammals do have eggs, even as humans. We have eggs, we just don't release our eggs outside of our body, fertilize. We have them fertilized inside of our body, and then they stay inside and develop into an organism. Whereas turtles, their amniotic egg gets fertilized inside, and then it has a shell that goes around it, and then they release it externally for the rest of development. And then, of course, hair is only in the leopard group.